Good. All right. Well, tonight we're actually going to start diving into Daniel. Tonight we're going to get through Daniel chapter 1 and start out with a question. Have you ever had to leave a life that was completely comfortable to you, to go somewhere, even whether it's short time or a long term? When I first moved here, I thought, oh, what am I getting myself into? I found out real quick, as scary as it seemed in my mind, it wasn't so scary after all. We picked and joked around when we first started thinking about coming here. We came for the trial weekend, and on the way home, Krista and I were talking. I said, well, at least there's a Walmart. But, it's amazing the things that you get used to. Growing up in Virginia Beach, I traded a surfboard for hunting gear. I traded the busy streets and traffic for 3 stoplights in town. So I like those changes. But what was a big change was going to Haiti, was going to India. When we went for those week or more trips, it was very much out of our comfort zones. We went because we felt the Lord leading for one reason or another. We were supporting different missions and felt like that was the next step, to be able to go and relate to the people and to be able to understand the circumstances they're dealing with and the way that we can pray for them and everything. But when we first got in the country, we realized we were in very different place. Places of commerce are still there. Some of the places we went to eat weren't that different from places we are here, but the cultures are different. The way people act is different. The way people think is very different. The language is a barrier every time we've gone. And so one of the things that I think about is we chose to do that. We chose to put ourselves in a situation to be able to go and minister in these different ways just short term. But as we get into Daniel chapter 1, we see right off the bat that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had absolutely zero choice. And so with that, let's get into Daniel chapter 1, and verses 1 and 2 really help set up exactly what happened. How did they end up leaving Judah to be able to go into this place where they ultimately were able to shine for God's glory? So Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 tell us, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. When we talked about how, when we look at the book of Daniel, it actually takes place over the course of about 70 years. Here we're seeing, depending on how you date it, 605, 604 BC. And it gives us some very good places to time this out. Historically, it says the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. One of the things that we studied about when we were going through 1st and 2nd Kings was about all the different kings and how God continued to allow Israel to be captured first, and then ultimately allowed Judah, the southern kingdom, to be captured, and it was all because of their sin. God had foretold these things were going to happen for years and years, and the people continued to turn from God. They turned back for a while, and then they'd turn to false worship. And so as a result, we get to this point in time, and before Nebuchadnezzar ever becomes part of this story of Judah, we know that Jehoiakim was a king, and he had been taken captive by the Egyptian Pharaoh Necho, N-E-C-O. Well, as they were under his authority, there was only certain things they could do. He was a vassal king, so he had to pay tribute and such. But Nebuchadnezzar, the way he came into this story is it says that during this 3rd year, he set his eyes on Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar led his forces to overcome the Egyptian, Assyrian coalition forces. They drove the Egyptian Pharaoh back to the lands of Egypt. But before going home, they set their eyes on Jerusalem because that was a pretty impressive city and lots of wealth that had dwindled over the years. But nonetheless, his eyes were on Jerusalem. And so that's where it gives us the timing. During that 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, whenever we look at ancient times, we talked about this a little bit last time, said that because all these different nations worshiped little g gods, all these different types of gods, they really tried to put the emphasis on, well, if militarily we have success, our God is better than your God. But notice what the text is very clear. We see this all throughout the text. Even though Nebuchadnezzar had the victory, he claimed the victory. He showed this by taking some of those important treasury pieces out of the temple in Jerusalem and took it and put it in his God's temple. We see this idea that he claimed it, but it says very clearly God was the one who orchestrated this. You know, when we look at the things that are happening in the world around us today, it's not always easy to see the big picture, but the thing that we see looking back is that they had to come to understand God told them, if you will not turn from your sin, I will judge you. I will take you into captivity. And this is just one of those instances where God allowed that to happen, but it was all within God's design. You know, the greater details are in 2 Kings 36 and 2 Chronicles 36 and 2 Kings 24. So if you want to study more about how he overtook them, that's why those are in the outline, to go back and look at it. But you think about it, God specifically was the one who gave Nebuchadnezzar the idea, the right, the honor and opportunity to go and attack Jerusalem and have success. God uses those hardships in our lives to draw us closer to Him, and ultimately this was the beginning of breaking the people of Judah, of the southern kingdom. Ultimately, we think about everything that we studied through Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, all through this time of captivity. It all began with Nebuchadnezzar taking them captive, and he didn't take everybody. Let's keep on reading verses 3 and 4, and we see how Nebuchadnezzar only took the best for himself. You know, when you take over someone, you want to take over resources, unfortunately, today. A lot of wars are fought over resources, oil, coal, other natural resources. But you think about this in verse 3 and 4, it says, Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So here's where we get into what I was talking about in the opening. It was one thing to have people come in and say, okay, you're now under our authority. Different times all throughout history we see where different nations conquer other nations, but they leave those people in place. They leave those governments in place. They just enforce them to give tribute to the new nation. They put different people into power and authority that will do whatever that new nation wants to do to be able to exert their authority. But in this particular case, it says that they actually allowed the king to stay there, but they began taking the cream of the crop. They took those who were from the noble families. They took those who were from the royal family so that they had leverage, but also because they were the ones who were educated. We have to remember, in this day and age, they didn't have public school, they didn't have private school and public university. So those who got the best education were those who could afford it, those who could have those private teachers, could even have other people from other nations to be able to come and teach them. And so that's why it's so important when it describes this. It said they wanted to take those people who had that mental capability of learning and that could be useful for the king. And so when we talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel, we're talking about young men. It says that they had to be handsome, that they had to be those blameless men. They had to have those good looks, but they also had to be wise. They had to have knowledge. They had to be teachable. Those don't always go hand in hand. But in this case, it says that those were the type of people they were looking for. They were looking for those who were skilled. So in other words, they were looking for people who at a bare minimum could be a liaison between King Nebuchadnezzar's authority and the people who remained in the promised land with various types of authority. But notice and think about all the things that they were challenged with. If they were just up and plucked out of the kingdom of Judah, out of Jerusalem, here's these men who speak Hebrew. Now all of a sudden they're taken to a different land and they have to learn a different language. But think about all the different barriers that they had to be able to overcome, and they didn't have a choice in this matter. They were handpicked by Ashpenaz and forced to leave, forced to relocate. And so you think about it, they had to overcome the language barrier. To me, that's the biggest thing. I have the most trouble learning a different language. I have enough trouble speaking English. I'm just going to be honest with you. If you think about it, my worst subject in school was always English. I thought it would be interesting if I could go back to talk to some of them and say, you're writing papers every week in teaching? And they just wouldn't believe it, I bet. But to learn another language, that's a difficult thing for a lot of people. And so again, this was something that God had to bless these men to be able to do, but also why they were looking for a select type of man to be able to bring from Judah into the new kingdom. So they had to learn a new language. They had to learn new literature. If you notice there, it said that they had to be able to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So it's one thing to learn verbally. A lot of us can learn things just by hearing it and speaking it, but they had to learn to be able to read and write in these different languages. They had to know the literature. What is it that the people were reading? What was it that their wise men had written that they needed to learn? And so you had that. Think about the culture. Again, I talked about you go to Haiti, you go to India, two completely different cultures, and a lot of microcultures in the middle of it all. And so going from America to there, we made the choice. I had to learn something about the culture and the people of India. I had to learn a little bit of their language to express some goodwill. And it was amazing how just a few words people would light up. Yeah, at least you're trying. But they had to learn the language, written, orally. They had to learn the literature. They had to learn the culture. How do I perform in the king's presence? Because that was why they were bringing them. They had to be trained so that they could ultimately stand before the king and do some kind of leadership in his presence. So they had to learn the culture. Not only this, they were probably not around a whole lot of people that looked and sounded like them. When we think about this, these were men who were taken to be trained, but they were going to be trained right alongside the other men that were being raised up for some kind of leadership position. So they probably had people that didn't look like them, sound like them. And then you had the religious beliefs. On top of everything else, it was the idea, how are we going to either maintain our faith in a foreign land, or are we going to be forced to learn about their faith and assimilate into their way of believing and worshiping? And so they had all these different things that they had to think about. Not to mention, they didn't have mom looking over their shoulder. These are young men being taken to train, so they didn't have the priest in the temple. They didn't have godly parents that were looking over them, making sure they made the right decisions. And so as parents and grandparents, we can understand how we hope for the best for our children. So all these different things were things that these young men had to face as they were ripped from everything they knew, taken to a foreign land, and then trained. Well, verses 5 through 7 say how God was with them, because this wasn't a quick and easy procedure. You think about when you send someone to college to get a degree, depending on what kind of degree it is, associate's 2-year, bachelor at least 4-year, sometimes 5 years, then on for specialty stuff. How long did they train for? Well, verse 5 tells us. Verse 5 picks up, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So, most times when we refer to these men, we refer to them by the names that were given to them, except Daniel. We just call Daniel, Daniel. But you notice each one of these young men were given a new name that was meant to try and overcome their worldview, their religious views, everything about who they were. It was part of that indoctrination process, trying to break them down and to mold them into the person they wanted them to be. We'll talk about those names in a minute. But think about it. The young men from Jerusalem were the cream of the crop. They had the best looks. They were educated to some extent before they ever came. But now they were going to spend 3 years just dedicated to studying, to learning the language, the culture, the literature, all those things we just talked about. And so this was not, they went for a semester, they came home for break. They didn't have spring break and fall break and everything in between. This was 3 years of extensive training to be able to get them ready to even stand before the king to see if they were going to be able to be used in service or not. When we think about this, one of the things that they struggled with that we hadn't talked about yet was the idea of what kind of food are they going to eat. One of the things that we have to remember about the Jewish nation is God set them apart to be a special and holy people. Part of what he did when he did that was he didn't just give them rules and regulations for worship, how to worship, what not to do, like we talked about this morning, but he also gave them a very specific dietary code, didn't he? Leviticus 11 gives one of those lists. We're not going to go through it for time's sake tonight, but gives a list of do's and don'ts for what to eat, what not to eat, what to drink, what not to drink. And so when we think about what it meant, it said that the food that the king ate was given to these men. Now at first, just first thought, as good American people that love to eat, that's, well, good, they got the best of the best. But we don't think about the things the way that they thought about it. Well, what kind of food were they being prepared? We're not told. We're just told that it was whatever the king got. But one of the things we have to remember was there was a spiritual element to the food as well. Even in the New Testament, you think about the Apostle Paul, one of the things that divided the church in Corinth had to do with food. And it wasn't even so much what food they were eating or not eating. It was what happened to that food before it was ever prepared and set before me. In Paul's day, it was food that had been sacrificed to idol gods and then sold in the market. And so when we think about this is a pagan king who worshiped false gods. He took some of the things that were in God's temple, put it in his false god's temple. And so we see all those practices that were still in the New Testament era go back to the Old Testament. And as they worshiped their false gods and they offered these animal sacrifices, that meat didn't go to waste. It went to be sold, just like it did in Paul's day. And so it's a possibility that one of the reasons that they wouldn't want to eat that food was that it might have been sacrificed to one of these false gods before it ever came to the king's table and then in turn brought to them. So again, it's one more thing that they had to deal with. Well, James E. Smith in his commentary helps us to understand again, why did they name them different names? A lot of times people come from different countries to America, even immigrating, they change their names to something that's more common, something that they're known by in America. Well, names used to mean something. They still do. You can still find baby's name book and it'll tell you what the names mean. But I thought it was interesting to look at this comparison. Think about each of the four men for just a moment. Hananiah means the Lord is gracious. He was named Shadrach, which means command of Aku. So again, it was given him a name that said, I'm under the command of a false god, this god Aku. Mishael means who is what God is. He was named Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. So he took that same thing, and again, one name relates to God Almighty, and they give him a name that relates to one of the gods that they worship. Azariah means the Lord has helped. He was named Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. And then the last one, Daniel, means God is my judge, and Belteshazzar means may Balak protect. So each time they gave him a new name, it had something to do with one of the false gods that they worshiped. Had to do with some characteristic of, your Hebrew name means your God is going to protect you, you're going to serve your God, something about your God. We want to get rid of that. If you're going to serve us, you're going to serve under our authority, you're going to serve under our gods. And so that's how they named them, was some way, again, it was an idea saying you used to belong to that God, now you belong to our gods. So we see they had a lot to overcome. And remember, they didn't ask for this. They didn't choose to do this. This wasn't the ministry opportunity of a lifetime that they hoped for. But yet, in the middle of it all, God's going to use it to be able to accomplish some great things. As Christians today, There are things that maybe we wouldn't choose that's kind of thrust upon us. Depending on where we're at and what group of people, there are people who believe things that we don't believe. They practice things that we don't hold to and can't hold to because of the teaching of Scripture, and yet the culture around us says, well, if we have the opportunity, we're going to indoctrinate you. One of the things, I just read a book, and I'm not going to do a preaching series on it, but it was an excellent book, and it was called We Will Not Be Silenced by Erwin Lutzer, Dr. Erwin Lutzer. And it really put into perspective everything that's going on in our culture right now, from the push for Marxism, call it by whatever name you want to call it, and the critical race theory, trying to talk about white privilege and everything else. And where do these things come from, and how does that fit in with Christianity? And the only reason I bring that up is because, we're kind of thrust into the middle of all this. We didn't ask to be, but yet this is the culture we now live in. This is what we're having preached at us in public schools, in public universities, and, the media is pushing this type of narrative. And so what are we going to do in the middle of it? Are we just going to allow it to impact and say, well, we can't win, so we might as well just give in and say, all right, just go for it? Or are we going to continue to hold our faith? Or are we continue to respectfully try to have conversation where we can? And that's what we see happen next. So they've got all this going on. For 3 years, they have to be taught. They have to be trained. They have to decide, are we going to remain faithful? Even the culture is completely anti-God around us because it's worshiping all these false gods. They're trying to teach us about things that maybe we don't even want to learn about, because part of the literature of the Chaldeans was all those things that had to do with enchantments and all the different type of wise men and magicians that we're going to see that they're compared against in chapter 2 next time. But look at what happens from the very beginning in verse 8 to 14, how they begin to decide, will we give in, or will we say we might have to live in this culture, but we don't have to let this culture drag us away from our God? And the first thing we see is that the men challenge the status quo of this culture for the sake of God. Look at verses 8 through 14. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food and with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king? Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. I think there's at least 3 things that we can learn about standing out in the culture around us, even as Christians, from this. The first thing is that it meant refusing the king's order to properly serve God. Well, here's this food. We're not told exactly what the food is, exactly what their reason for not wanting to eat and drink this particular food. But it said that for God's sake, it said it would cause them to defile themselves if they ate and drank this stuff. So the first thing that we see is that there is a place for that civil disobedience, but notice how they went about it. They didn't just say, we're not going to eat it, we're not going to drink it, and throw it back at the servants. Instead, it says that they have this, what appears to be a respectful conversation. Because of our faith, because this will defile us, we can't eat these things. Is there any way around it? Is there any way that we can have something different? And so they put that out there, but notice how it opened the door for conversations. Well, if I do this for you and you don't look good and you don't perform well, it's going to come back to me. So do you really want me to risk my head because I didn't let you eat what you were supposed to eat and start with? But again, it opened conversation, and he continues on, and he's very specific. Well, let's try an experiment. For the next 10 days, let us just eat fruits and vegetables. Let us have water to drink. We don't have to do this very long. If it doesn't work out, we'll do what you want us to do. But you see how it started. It started with, we can't do this, it'll defile us. Well, what do you want me to do about it? I don't want to put my head on the line for you. I don't worship the way you do, and I have to report to my king, and I'm fearful of him. So he takes the next step. Well, let's try an experiment. Let's do something for just 10 days. Surely 10 days isn't that big a deal, and when you think about 3 years of training. So from the very beginning, he's willing to bring out this and say, you know what, we don't want the things that he eats. We don't want to drink this wine. So we want to do something different and just test us. Notice something else. It meant refusing to compromise their faith for an easier life. We said mom and dad weren't there to tell them no. They were growing up. They had to make their own decisions. And so they had to rely on the fact that they had been taught faith from the earliest ages, that this was ingrained in them, that they weren't going to turn from it no matter where they went in life on their own. And so they come to this point and says, well, we could easily just take this food, eat it. None of our people will know about it. Mom and dad won't know about it. The priests aren't here to tell us no. It would just make life easier if we just do this. But instead of taking the easy road, they took the harder road to have that conversation, to see what would happen from there, to put their faith to the test, to see if this would even be something they could continue to do going forward. But they had the faith that if they continued to eat a diet that they were accustomed to, that wouldn't defile their faith, that God was going to come through. But then the third thing that we see is that it meant being noticeably different. They would stand out like a sore thumb, as we say, wouldn't they? Everyone else is eating meat, they're drinking the wine, they're just enjoying food, they're living it up. Why? Well, because it's there. But instead, here they are eating a vegetarian diet. They're just drinking water. And so you don't know how that may have looked to everyone else around them, but it still meant standing out. Well, really, what was the whole purpose of God giving the Old Covenant law to the Jewish people in the first place? Wasn't it to make them stand out? A different way of thinking, a different way of worshiping, to worship the one true God, to worship one God instead of a bunch of gods, to have a dietary code that looked different than everybody else around them, and so it made them stick out. What about the New Testament, the New Covenant? Isn't it supposed to make us stick out from the rest of the world? The way we talk, the way we act, how we believe, how we worship, the way we interact with other people. Jesus was very upfront that if you follow him, you're going to look different. You're going to stick out. And so, in this regard, we're seeing these same type of things that we have to make a decision about today. And so, with all this said, he's willing to come before the man and he says, I'm willing to be different. I'm willing to test my faith if you'll just let us do it. And so, ultimately, the servant was willing to do it. Well, as a result of all of this, their faithfulness to God indeed set an example for the whole corps of trainees. Now, they didn't have to change their diet, but they could see a very distinguishable difference between Daniel and his friends and the rest of those that were being trained. Pick up in verse 15 and 16. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Maybe they were from the country. You think about this, a lot of what we see was that what people could grow for themselves. Even in the world today, in a lot of your other nations, you see a lot more vegetarians, but it was something that was important to them. They said, well, can we do this? And they said, okay, we're going to test them. So what happened? 10 days passed. All they've been allowed to do is have water and vegetables. So now they have to stand. We don't know exactly what that test looked like, but the chief that was over them obviously was able to compare them to the rest of those who were eating and drinking. They were still having to learn, do their studies. There was probably some physical education in there as well to make them stronger and ready for any kind of opportunity that they would have to serve down the road. But it says that after 10 days, all of a sudden they were better in their appearance. Everything about them looked better. Maybe they had a better complexion. Maybe they had more energy. I think about it, and I've been playing with this idea of trying to change up my diet again for a while. but I thought about that as I was studying this, and I still hadn't quite got there. We've got too many goodies in the house right now. But you think about it, what happens when we eat a lot more food that's got more fat, more cholesterol, more sugar? You think about the effects of alcohol and how it all really just completely changes the energy that we have, the ability to sleep, the ability to think. And so if you think about it, if these other men are having as much food as they want, they're having all this fatty meat, they're having drink every night. We don't know how much they drink, but if they're eating all this food that's not really so great for the body in the first place, it's going to show. Now, one of the things I think is interesting here, and it translates in appearance, but also fatter in the flesh, it's actually firmer in the flesh. It's the idea that they had a firmer physique instead of being just big and flabby like I think of. They were fatter in the flesh. It was the idea that they were more toned. They had a better complexion about themselves. And so you think about it, they were better in appearance, their flesh looked better, but as a whole, they could tell that after 10 days there was something drastically different about them. The same's true today. One of the things that I've been thinking about ever since last weekend, one of the guys that's a coach for Chris's shotgun team realized he was a little overweight and has got a young little girl that's growing up and wants his attention, wants him to go and do things. And he was talking about how he had talked to someone in the community, how they'd lost all this weight, eating a certain amount of protein, but even more vegetables and getting rid of the carbs and everything. And so he said he's been trying to do this and has lost 17 pounds in 2 weeks. Well, I think that's pretty unhealthy, but, it's this idea, I want to change, I want to do something. I got more energy, my sugar levels are better, but it all came from changing what he was eating. So it's understandable that after 10 days, there may have been something very drastic between the way these men looked versus the way the others looked, the way they were able to comprehend things, the way they were able to progress with their training. And if you think about it, what did Adam and Eve eat? Fruits and vegetables. They were given the produce of the land. It wasn't until after the flood in Genesis 9 that we see that God officially gave permission for man to begin eating meat. They did before that, but this is the first time in Scripture where we see that God actually gave that concession that they could be able to eat meat. And ever since then, we've just been enjoying it. But you think about it, there is something to be said for a certain kind of diet, and that's why there's a lot of different Christian parts of the community that still have what they call the Daniel diet, that's all vegetarian, or they go even beyond that to vegan, but I'm not going there. All right, but the point is, he said, look, let's test God's ways. If it's food and drink that we shouldn't eat versus things that are healthy, things that God has given us from the beginning to eat, and water, can we do it? Yes. Do we look better? Yes. Are we able to meet all your expectations? Yes. So notice what happens. It was a 10-day experiment, but then from that day forward, he says, you know what? Y'all are doing so good. I don't care if you want it or not. You're not allowed to have it anymore. So he took the meat, he took the wine, and from then on, it was vegetables and water only for the rest of their training. But that's what they asked for. It was based on their faith and their objection to the food, and God blessed that and used it as one way to overcome all that indoctrination, if you will, to be able to maintain their faith and to be able to continue to distinguish themselves from everyone else. Well, let's close with verses 17 through 21 for tonight. And God vindicates their faithfulness through all this training. It says, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. That's how we mark the time period. From the time of Nebuchadnezzar to the time of King Cyrus, we have a 70-year period of history. And through all this time, because he was willing to remain faithful to God, And God put him in places where he could influence the kingdom. It said that in one way or another, even though the empires changed, even though the kings changed, Daniel was able to continue to be an influence in the kingdom for God, which first started with Nebuchadnezzar taking them and forcibly removing them and putting them in a really tough position. And so when we think about that, sometimes God uses the poor, those that are uneducated, to be able to shame the wise. But then again, sometimes he uses those who have already been given certain gifts and abilities and just refines them and uses those anyway. And so we see here that Daniel and his friends were all given different spiritual gifts. They were able to be wise. They were able to learn. They were able to distinguish themselves from everybody else that the king brought in as advisors. But again, we see that pagan nature. Think about Egypt, when Moses went to be able to ask the Pharaoh to let God's people go. What kind of people did the Pharaoh bring in to counter Moses? Brought in the magicians, brought in the enchanters. Well, you can throw your staff down and make a snake. I got wise men, I got magicians, they can do the same thing. So as we get into chapter 2, we're going to see that becomes a big deal. He calls in not Daniel and his friends first, but he calls in all kind of magicians and enchanters and all these supposedly wise people that can read the signs and everything else. But it's ultimately going to be Daniel and these other 3 men that God is willing to give wisdom to give knowledge to be able to give that ability to interpret dreams and visions, and even give Daniel visions himself. And so God used that, but when they stand before the king inquires them. He grills them. He's interrogating them. He's asking them this. He's asking them that. But because they have been through the training, they know what the right answers are, but they also have the godly answers beyond that. They're able to impress the king, notice, 10 times better than anybody else. And not just 10 times better than those that were trained, but better than any of the advisors he had throughout the kingdom. So again, we see as they were willing to put their faith in God, God used that faith, grew that faith, and even gave them the spiritual gifts that they needed to be able to do ministry. Wouldn't it be great if we had more leaders seeking and putting Christians into place, asking, there's something different about you. How would you handle this? We can pray for them. When we get the opportunity, we can talk to them. But one of those things that's so interesting to me is that here this man is, he never really truly appears to convert to not Christianity, but faith in God, Judaism. But we see again and again, he's going to have his eyes open. And the more that he has his eyes open, the more he's going to trust these men to make those decisions to help him. And so it just amazes me why people wouldn't be seeking these kind of advisors today. But anyway, just something to think about. Well, as we close, the overriding message that we get out of the book of Daniel, especially chapter 1, is God is active in the affairs of people. He has given us His Word for a reason. He's even talked about diet in the Scriptures for a reason, to be able to help us see what's most beneficial. But the point is, He says, if we will trust His Word, if we will do things His way, God is able to open doors that we can't open on our own. And they're not always doors that we would choose, but when they're open, those opportunities are presented them. If we will hold our faith, if we'll pray about them, there are just unknown opportunities there that God can use us in the small things of life, or on up to the greatest opportunities where we might be able to help influence somebody in a way that just completely changes their life around. But it all starts with that faithfulness and looking for those opportunities. How do I maintain my faith in a culture that is becoming more and more anti-Christ, anti-God, so that I can still be an impact on the world around me? I might stick out like a sore thumb, but that's okay. God can still use me. But will I have that boldness like Daniel did to say, hey, I can't do this. What can we do to fix it? I'm still willing to obey the rest of the laws and the rules so much as I can, but this is something that I can't do. And we see where God opened the door for that concession. So we need to look for those opportunities today as well. Well, we're going to close there. Is there any question or comment before we close? Well, the thing is, it says that it took their meat and their drink. So it didn't mean everybody else that was being trained had to give it up. But it was just Daniel and his 3 buddies that had the meat and the wine taken away. They set an example for everybody else, But it doesn't say that everybody else had to give it up. It just said that they had it taken away. They opened their mouths and they said, you did such a good job, we're going to make you keep on doing it. So, but it is interesting to think about how many others might have wondered or possibly even had some of it taken away to see how it would work out for them. So anyhow. All right, well, if you will